point being is they're very similar approaches to performance. And so they're competing largely for the same segment of users. And if you are a believer in the narrative that that segment of users may in fact be all the users, then a clean slate implementation, which can learn off what Solana has done and where it has failed, is actually really promising. And here we go. Back for another episode of the Spelunking podcast. We have yet to release the previous one because we're lazy and, well, you had an excuse. What was your excuse?
I have an excuse. I have been on an early summer vacation in April. That's my excuse.
Right.
And I completely forgot that we had an episode in the can.
Yeah, and I'm currently in Bali with the family, so I also haven't been paying attention very much. Or I did actually think at times that maybe I should prod you to edit it, but then, I was in the swimming pool and I thought, whatever.
So we're very sorry to all 5 of you that regularly wait for this with bated breath. We just, life.
Yeah. We'll see if we end up publishing it. Depends kind of on whether it's more news heavy or concept heavy. But this, in some ways, this feels nice. Good. I think so typically we go every sort of 2 weeks, or at least we try to go every 2 weeks. We very rarely achieve it. But I think that's, to me, because I like discussing more of the sort of conceptual things and not so much the sort of, pressing news things. Having a slightly longer period of time actually feels quite good. I feel like I've generated enough new thoughts and things to be angry at.
Okay, so this is going to be a ranty one, or?
No. I'm actually very excited right now. So maybe as highly intellectual starter for this episode, I quickly did some maths and I came to the conclusion that the cycle, the crypto cycle, is very consistently 4 years long. And so you have at the lowest point in the bear market, either in the first year after the bull market or the second year. And then the third year usually is around and about double in terms of market cap. And it sort of slowly goes up for the sort of the last 2 years, and then you have another bull market. But this is how it's been going now for basically as many cycles as we have reasonable data on, unless you go back before, 2013. Like, there is data on it. Its reliability is very questionable. And it's just Bitcoin and all this other stuff. Another interesting thing, like, I've done this many times before. I just kind of look at the numbers in this very naive, stupid way. But I think, I'm not trying to do any kind of crazy technical analysis, just kind of like what is the sort of very high level pattern. And I do feel like there's a lot of truth in that pattern in a way, because that is sort of the easily understandable pattern, right? Like, it really does seem like every, 4 years, people are expecting something to happen because you have this very sort of dramatic increase suddenly after a long period of sort of inching upwards. So I don't know. The other thing that was interesting was that the fluctuations, like the sort of the peak and the bottom, they change quite a lot. So the crash is usually sort of 70 to 80%. And this is, I'm not looking at everything, right? I'm looking at the big. So I'm primarily looking at Bitcoin for the early years and then adding some other stuff later years. But so something like that. But then the rise fluctuates a little bit, but it's sort of on the magnitude of 1,000% or more historically. And we'll see. It hasn't, Like you can use different numbers for those, but if you sort of generally believe that cycle continues, then we would be looking at 2015, 2025 for the next potential bull market. So instead of making a $1 million bet that the United States dollar is going to crash in 90 days, I will make a prediction that the bull market is going to happen in 2025.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet against that, mostly because it correlates with how I think about these things. I hadn't necessarily thought in terms of 4 years, but it does match the reason that I use, which is that usually the bull markets, like the proper bull market, crazy thing, seems to come between 6 to 9 months after a US election because they start injecting money to make the economy look good because nobody wants to be the idiot who blew up the economy. And that ends up spreading out until, you end up getting into a crypto bull market a little bit after the election. So- and I think that the
On a
next
4-year
one would
cycle.
be, yeah, exactly. It's every 4 years, and the next election would be in 2024, which would mean that I think we had discussed at one point that I thought they were going to start putting money in, say, 5 months before the election. That would mean is that it actually reaches that money ends up reaching people who want to put it into Bitcoin and Dogecoin or whatever, probably by early 2025. So yeah, that matches.
Or Pepe, as is the new thing. Though I'm not paying attention, so I
Apparently,
want to discuss
yeah, let's not go into. I haven't looked into what crack people are smoking on that side nowadays.
that. The only thing I saw on Twitter relating to that was that some guy had just market sold like some ludicrous amount, like I don't know, it was like 4 million or something, and had taken by a price impact, taken I think it was a 600,000 or 700,000 hit on
Yeah.
spot price. And people were so angry. They were like, why would you do that? Like, why don't you sell slowly? And it's like, well, you know, maybe you don't think that it's actually worth the market price. And
Yep.
you're willing to get out whatever you can.
Well, look, first, it's people looks at these things. Whoever does this, probably looks at these things like free money, and then you could spread out. I think it was $1.75 million in ETH that they got out. Yeah, you could spread that out across say 10 sales, but price might be 50% down by half of those. So why?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's
Yeah,
like,
but my favorite argument actually for that I actually sourced from some people around us, and hopefully we're not going to spend too long on the topic, was somebody saying, "But you're fucking up the chart." I mean, like,
yeah, exactly. You're fucking up the chart. That was. Yeah, this is great. We say we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to spend time on it, and then we end up talking about it. So I think it was in the episode we haven't published or the previous episode, we were talking about Near's blockchain operating system.
that was the previous one, I think.
Okay. So we've spent some time looking into it, and I think I kind of get it, like what they're trying to do. And I've changed my mind slightly on how silly I think it is. Or maybe I think it's possibly still silly, but I do want them to do it.
So you're okay. Tell me more. Tell me more.
Yeah, I'm wording this very specifically. So, like, basically, they just want to create. They want to put code onto the Near blockchain, and then you sort of get this. Everything is sort of public by default. Everything is workable by default, and then they, as I understand it, basically have like a standard way of interacting with that code or utilizing that code. And so you build these sort of widgets or even like smaller mechanisms that other people can then use in their applications because the code is just there, right? And they're specifically targeting sort of more front endy type systems. And so that I think is sort of broadly like, so I've begun to understand this a little bit better. I had a conversation with Ilya, the founder, the other week, and he kind of explained it to me. One thing I do want to say is like, for what I just described was not clear to me from the docs or from any of their materials. So, and I gave him this feedback. I said that I think they've done an extremely poor job of explaining what the hell this blockchain operating system is. But that's basically it. Is it's almost like decentralized GitHub in a way, just hosted on the Near blockchain, right? And they're trying to make it as composable as possible. And I like, so maybe one thing to emphasize here is that it does seem like this is a relatively good fit for a sharded blockchain because it's quite cheap. So I've not really previously figured out how sharding would be useful, but it actually does make sense for this because you are using it as a database. So they're approaching it like they're approaching building their L1 sort of like a database. And this is sort of a use case that uses their L1 as a database, one where you have sort of automatically, well, first of all, you have persistent storage. Secondly, you have sort of change logs, everything sort of built in.
Wait, how do you have persistent
So
storage?
go ahead.
Because on what I saw, the stuff was being served from IPFS.
My understanding is that it's going on to the Near blockchain.
Okay.
Could be wrong. Could be wrong. But did not see any mentions of IPFS anywhere in the docs.
I'm just saying that when they launched the demo and the docs, we have already established that docs are not very useful. But when they launched this demo, I went and just check what they were doing, started looking at the network requests, and the stuff was being served from an IPFS gateway of their own. IPFS.near.something something.
Hmm. Well, that's something to check then. I mean, you could always store a hash of the code, I guess, and then store the code elsewhere. It does add some complexity, but at least in interacting with it, you don't have anything that resembles that. But we'll check that at some point later. Well, to get to my point, I think I think sort of what they're trying to do is something that in some ways has been tried many times before. It's not that dissimilar from what Radical is trying to build. It's actually not that dissimilar. I don't know if you remember this Ethereum browser called Mist.
We actually discussed it back then, I think.
Yeah, but so I think the odds of success are relatively low. But I realized at some point that I actually do want people to try. And I think I'm a bit jaded and a bit cynical because I've seen it tried so many times and I'm not sure if people are going to use it. But no one has really tried at the scale of Near as of yet. One thing I am a bit worried about, and I don't think they have anything in place for that yet, is monetization. So because you have default everything open, you do have this issue of like no one can really monetize anything because everything can be forked a million times. And so I think that's something that they probably need to figure out for it to sort of be really useful. But I broadly sort of like it. That's my current view.
And it makes more sense that we're going to pivot into a dashboard, right? Of course. But I mean, I don't want to go down. You just invented Arweave meme, but it sounds like you've just invented Arweave only with IPFS on the back as well. So how is this different? If we talk about storing code that other people can fork and that is always available, how and targeting from the developers on top of, how is this different from just building an app on the perma web?
I mean, it probably isn't that different, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. I I guess if
Like you,
nothing else,
you
they're by moving into this, they're competing into a smaller market. I mean, assuming that Arweave is the competitor here, right? They're at the very least competing into a smaller market than trying to compete with Solana and Ethereum. But
well, this is it. I mean, so okay, let's look at it this way. Near is not really competing with Solana or Ethereum. For a long time, it tried to position as if it was, but like the reality today is that it's not.
I
So,
agree with that statement.
so, but they do have scale. So potentially pivoting into a smaller market or a market that's smaller now that they think will grow considerably could be a good move, right? Like you can see that working out if you can sort of just take over developer mindshare, even if it is a subpar product, which I'm gonna talk about a little bit in a sec, that could play out well, right? And in fact, that is probably what you have to do instead of endlessly competing with
Yeah.
especially since that whole segment of blockchains is going in a very different direction, right? Like the competition now is not like it's not like whether you're sharded or not sharded. It's like are you going maximum performance and minimum cost, or are you going ZK proof everything, which are the two directions, and they're not really in either. And I don't see them being able to really enter either effectively. And so I don't know. It's not that dumb. The other thing is that which is an interesting decision, is that they're going a little bit closer to the user. I feel like than Arweave is. So they're putting a lot of emphasis on building out kind of the user experience, and I don't mean necessarily retail end user, although they've done that as a reference point, but developer experience and all that stuff, right? So they might be able to craft sort of tools and products better than Arweave can. Maybe. I don't know. Generally speaking, I think they're like developer tools, their UIs, everything, and they're pretty good. These are not necessarily differentiating factors, but I do feel like Arweave has typically had a more like we're gonna stay pretty firmly on the infrastructure side of things and sort of let the community build everything. And then I feel like this is a slightly more kind of full stack approach. I don't know. But whatever happens, I want decentralized GitHub to exist. This is sort of a sub section of a decentralized GitHub in the respect that it's mainly for this like modular components, specifically for UIs. But I want that to exist anyway.
I agree with that. I Again, I would think I would be a lot if I were going to take a bet on this space, which I'm not right now, but I would be a lot more likely to take a bet on Radical or something built on Arweave, or there are other efforts that have been working in this direction for a while. I don't necessarily think that just pivoting into something unless you have some particular insight is a recipe for any sort of success. But anyway, that space is where I was just looking. I was literally yesterday helping a friend do some light diligence on a project that shall remain unnamed, but they do have Git on the name, and they're going for a decentralized GitHub kind of thing built on top of a particular chain. And I mean, first of all, their initial numbers, the initial numbers that they sent sounded so sensational that I thought this is completely made up. And then I was like, ask these questions, get these details. And it turns out like, oh no, we actually have like 1,000 users and we don't really know how many of these are active, or we're just farming like the artifact. Okay, cool. So that space is so early that who
There
knows,
we go.
maybe they can actually make it in. It-
Well,
we have crossed my interest of threshold, I guess.
yeah. So one last thing on this: if this means more competition for Arweave, I also think that's a good thing. I think Arweave has
I
been
agree, but
unbelievably slow, and
look,
I'm mainly just grumpy about the ledger integration
I
still.
am grumpy about the ledger integration. I am surprised that they haven't gotten more traction. I, I don't know, man. At this point, Arweave is starting to give me Zcash vibes. Like they get a ton of stuff technically right, and then they just don't follow through in some areas or don't get the traction that I would expect based on the work that they're doing. I've no idea what's going on there. I don't think it's lack of competition, frankly. If I were in Arweek's position, I would have considered many of the developments on the Falcon side of things to be competition. And I don't think necessarily that Arweave is going to interpret this as competition, particularly considering how terrible a job Near is doing of explaining what the hell it is they're doing. So you have to basically, as you did, sit them down and try to extract from them what the hell their target market is. And I'm not sure people can be ours. So I agree, and I'd be happy to get more decentralized developer tools, if nothing else. I just, again, if you're pivoting into this, I'm not sure how inside your brain, how many changes that you're bringing, and if whatever thing you were building before was getting a whole bunch of data from IPFS, then you're clearly not dogfooding stuff at this stage. It'll be like, are we serving some files from S3? I don't know.
I'll look into the IPFS thing because I really don't know. But anyway, before we dig too much, I do want to have this conversation about Filecoin and Arweave. But before that, I want to maybe chat a little bit about sort of data availability layers and data retrievability. So just to define those for the conversation, data availability is basically being able to prove that data was available to be downloaded or to be synced from some node. And then data retrievability is a guarantee that you can get the data at a later point in time. They're sort of very similar sounding concepts, but generally, if you look at the data availability layers, Celestia, Avail, Eigenlayer DA, etc., the data availability proof is basically a proof that the data was available for a period of sort of 2 weeks or something. So the purpose is not to store it as such. The purpose is to have allowed or to ensure that nodes or other ecosystem participants could have downloaded the data had they wanted at a certain point in time. And then data retrievability is sort of distinct from that because there you assume persistence. So you're expecting and you're getting guarantees that the data you are putting into the system you will be able to get at a future time, and assuming that you're paying the costs, whatever they may be, that it should be there sort of in perpetuity. No, so data availability is kind of the thing that's been the big thing recently, which is kind of interesting to me. And I've really been trying to figure out kind of like what, not so much is data availability useful. It's definitely useful for a roll up, or specifically, especially for an Ethereum roll up where you have proof that's verified on chain, and then you have sort of this X amount of transaction data that others. So if you have a roll up, you have a ZK roll up, you have a sequencer. The sequencer gets a whole bunch of transactions. It creates a proof, or it outsources proof creation, but it gets a proof that it then verifies on Ethereum. And in order for that proof to have any value, the network or the ecosystem needs to know what transactions were included in that proof. And so that's kind of where data availability comes in, is that instead of putting all those transactions in some form onto Ethereum, which defeats the whole purpose of the rollup, you instead have create this data availability proof that the transactions were available to the rest of the network, so the network can trust the proof that was verified on chain. So just to recap, I think that is a real thing. There is a need for that, and at least in the Ethereum ecosystem. However, some quick comments. That does not guarantee that, for example, a new full node can sync. And so you're relying on the ecosystem nodes to then distribute that data further and do that of their own free will, which is without any incentive to do so, by the way. So it creates some opportunities for kind of what I could maybe call network capture. So you have some nodes who have the history, and if they form a cartel, they could basically prevent anyone else from syncing. There's ways around that. Obviously, this is like a different shape of the same problem that decentralized networks have anyway. But what has sort of been on my mind is sort of two questions. One is, how valuable is that's very specific thing, getting a data availability proof that it was available? And I'm specifically thinking about this in terms of like, how valuable is that business case? And does that business case realistically justify the valuations that these things are raising at? Because in my mind, it's not like that's, that is a very narrow thing. Data retrievability, on the other hand, makes a lot of sense that there is a business case potentially because you're storing something in perpetuity. And then the other thing that I've been thinking about, and then I'll let you comment, is like, wouldn't the easier solution to this just be that like the transactions, why don't you just shove the transactions onto Arweave by default? So you could have a sequencer design that doesn't actually take transactions from users directly. The user shoves them into Arweave and the sequencer gets them from there. So first of all, you remove trust from the sequencer because the sequencer can now no longer omit. I guess they still maybe can. I'm not sure, but basically, like, what transactions should be in there. And so other participants in the ecosystem can sort of build the correct state regardless of what the sequencer does. The sequencer can obviously probably omit like a certain transaction from the proof itself, but yeah, you have like something like that. And I haven't, thought this all the way through, but it seems like would make more sense potentially. And I've been asking some of the different availability projects about this, and they are all sort of going for this very narrow use case. And I've been wondering why you wouldn't go for kind of both. Like, wouldn't that make sense? But I don't know. What do you think? That was a lot. I'm sorry.
Well, actually, I should have taken notes because I do have to quibble with some of the things that I think you said, but I may have misunderstood you.
And maybe I was wrong. So quibble.
Okay. So first of all, an asterisk. The one that I have looked into the most has been Celestia. So any comment that I make is specifically about that one. I might be missing something about the other ones. For instance, but going back, like one of the last things you said was about, and maybe we can repeat this, but why wouldn't you store the whole thing on Arweave so that, the various rollups can't just pick and choose or something of the sort, right? For starters, on Celestia's case, as far as I understand, they don't really particularly even care about the canonical state of the world. Like, they provide transaction ordering, data availability, and they store proofs, but they don't verify the proofs. Like, you could be taking Celestia and store a whole bunch of invalid proofs in it. It is up to the rollups to decide which proofs are valid or not. right? So
Yeah.
let's start with that, because I think you also made a remark earlier about how if you have approved it, then you know that it was. But in Celestia's case, you might be storing transaction proofs that are completely invalid. So the rollup still needs to decide of, does this make sense for my view of the world or not? So that is one thing. As what you said about the valuation that these things are going for, I'm not going to comment on it, because I think that this kind of stuff, okay, first of all, Celestia, to its credit, I think was the first thing that I encountered in 2022, which made me go like, wait, what? What the hell are you doing here? Which usually means there's something interesting there, right? It might not be them, but there's something interesting there. The fact that it made me stop. I
Yeah.
wonder how much of that, how much this has to do with the valuations that they're going at. There's something that really kind of like lack a frame of reference for for investors out there. So maybe this is what causes prices to become a little bit untethered. If we could say like, oh, if like we were discussing earlier, Sui is launching, let's compare its fully diluted valuation with Solana, because they're kind of like moving in the same direction. You have a framework there. For this, maybe you don't. Now, it might also be the fact that if I okay, let me put the salesman hat on. If I were the guy running this protocol and I wanted to present what its edge is, probably the what I would lean into is the fact that since Celestia itself doesn't care about the canonical state of the world, then that means that you could build a whole host of different things on top that behave in a different way, while Celestia still behaves as the as the proof storage for every one of these things. You no longer would
Yeah.
need different L1s to spring up if you want to build different
But
things.
but to be clear, so yes, that is the pitch, right? But to be clear, they store data availability proofs, which are distinct from ZK proofs. And so my question is specifically like, what is the value of data availability sampling and data availability proof storage? So I understand the pitch. You can build sovereign rollups. You can build
Yeah.
like the modular rollup thing. I get it, and I broadly speaking think it's a good direction, because it'll just make it really really easy to do rollups. I think that's the main thing. Like, you can do all this shit in from scratch in your rollup. That's fine, but it's just a lot of stuff to figure out. So if you get it from somewhere, that might be easier. But I'm not sure like about the value. But I think what you said was exactly right. There's no frame of reference. And now that I'm thinking about it, all of the valuations which have been kind of a little bit bonkers recently have been ones where there's really very little frame of reference. So Eigenlayer, Flashbots, Celestia. They're basically all the things I'm kind of
Yeah.
like sort of somewhat excited about, which is probably also correlated. But in a lot of like, I think the argument for why token has much value is clearer in some ways in something like Flashbots than it is in Celestia, because of how narrow the system is. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's some calculation one can do. Like, if we just assume there are thousands of these rollups and they all use this DA, like, what does that mean? But if you have like 1,000 rollups on Celestia seems like a lot of rollups, right? Much more than what we currently have. I don't know how many rollups we're gonna have, but 1,000 is a lot. And if there's 1,000 customers paying you, is that $1 billion?
Well, I haven't looked into the token economics and whatnot, but what you're getting into, I think, here, and apologies to whomever invested on this things and put it to this valuation, but I think that the issue is that you're looking at
probably would have invested as well. To be clear,
At
like
at this
probably,
valuation, you're questioning if it's worth this much. So would you have invested at this
I'm
valuation?
questioning. So, well, there's the one thing that we're not touching and we probably shouldn't touch is the speculative value, but that's
Sure. But that's what I was getting into actually, which is why I was apologizing to whomever pushed it to this valuation, because it sounds to me like you're making a rational analysis here. And a lot of these things, like with the Sui versus Solana valuation, they tend to be really highly valued early on because they're pure raw potential, right? There's this thing and everything wonderful is going to come out of it. It hasn't really faced contact with the enemy yet. It's once you throw this out into the world and they have to actually collide with real market forces. We just start saying like, yeah, maybe we're not going to get a million roll-ups on this. Yeah, maybe it's really hard getting developers for this thing. And then things start getting into a little bit more of a rational stage, right? So that there might be also some of that going on. It's just early and it's pure raw potential. It's the beautiful kid that's going to do wonderful things, not the asshole teenager that refuses to stay up when there's a mint.
yeah, that's probably it. And I do think it's cool. I do wonder. I do wonder how the interplay between retrievability and data availability is going to happen because it's sort of like they're different, but they're not that different. Like Filecoin could add random sampling, right?
Yeah, well,
Like
tell that to the people who were storing stuff on Falcon for like a couple of years before they could actually retrieve it.
that's true. That's true. Or maybe so we have two segues here. I'll let you choose which one we segue to. We can segue into the Sui conversation or the Filecoin Arweave conversation. What do you think?
I think the Sui one is going to be shorter, so maybe we can start with that one.
All right.
And it's
Sui
just a numbers
launched
game, basically.
yesterday.
Yes,
Yeah,
mainnet, finally.
Sui launched yesterday, mainnet. They had a token sale for like a few days before it. I think when trading started, the first value was like $4 or something, which made the network value momentarily for a very, very short period of time. It made the network value like 40 billion. And then it obviously dropped like a stone, but it settled at about 12 billion fully diluted value, which is not far, or sort of it's been in like the 12 to 15 billion range,
Yeah.
which is a little bit higher than Aptos and I guess similar-ish to Solana. But this has been a thing that's happened. So Aptos fully diluted value has been higher than Solana at some point, which I thought was very funny. But so I do want to maybe give a little bit of context on Sui. So Sui and Aptos both basically spun out of Facebook, the DM or whatever project,
Libra.
and they utilize the Move VM object-oriented programming for the crypto ecosystem. And you had, I have some more stuff on the specific architectures, but you had some gripes. So maybe we should do that first and then I can counter.
Yes, I wouldn't say gripes necessarily. I do have an issue with the valuation, which I think it is absurd to place the same fully diluted valuation for something that just launched, hasn't demonstrated any sort of real world battle testing, nor the fact that they can sustain a developer community, as of something that has done all those things for a few years. I suspect that a lot of this is one, speculative value, and second, unit cost bias, right? Something that's worth $1.20 looks much cheaper than something that's worth $20 if you don't look at the fully diluted valuation. So I imagine there's no small amount of it. Now, I can't really comment on Swiss choices, precisely since I really haven't looked into it more. I've looked a little bit more on Aptos since it was actually out there, and I could talk to validators who were running on Aptos, and I know a couple of people who are actually working on projects on Aptos. I don't know a single one on Sui, but my issue with that was just basically it's too freaking early, and some of the design doesn't make sense. Like on Aptos, when I looked at the validation, stake was double opt-in. Basically, if I was running a validator, not only you had to want to give me your stake, but I had to whitelist your address. So that was one thing that didn't really make any sense. If I recall, there was a small validator set. I don't remember at this point the exact details. And from what I remember, they didn't even have delegation until like a week or two ago. So it was basically a thing of this is way too early, way too immature for something that's valued at this time. Now, the gripe that I did have with, by the way, I did have one gripe now that I remember, and it had to deal with the implications of this double opt-in stake, which was the fact that if you didn't have permissionless stake, where I could just give you my stake if I wanted, then this was likely to make stake decentralization and stake rebalancing much more difficult or much more unlikely to happen. So I would expect that would lead to more stake concentration. Given that we have stake concentration anyway, like probably doesn't really make any practical difference. But I think that was the gripe that I had at the time.
Right. Okay. So basically, what happened is Aptos launched went very close to Solana's valuation, so we launched them very close to Solana's valuation. They're all in the same sort of ballpark. And in Aptos and Sui, that valuation is based on promises and dreams and hopes. In Solana, there's some tangible stuff there, and it's been much more battle tested. So I'm not going to defend those valuations specifically, but I will say that I think sort of on a very high level, like it makes sense to me why that happened. I am very bummed that that happened because I would have loved to buy Sui at a way lower valuation. But I understand why. In Sui's case, specifically the fact that Aptos was there, I think was a big factor because the prevailing sentiment is that sort of, at least sort of what I've heard tangentially from people is that Sui is kind of like the real version and Aptos is sort of more the marketing version or something like that.
Interesting.
That's sort of the narrative. Whether that's true or not, right? I think it could be, it could not be, I don't care. But that narrative, I think, played to Sui's favor. And so it was basically guaranteed that Sui would go to around the same level because there's a lot of it is the same, but
And there was a frame of
little bit of a
reference.
narrative. Yeah, and there's a frame of reference. Exactly. So that I think like fact that they are sort of near Solana is, I think, or I agree it's premature. But I do think sort of makes sense from the perspective of sort of the broader competition and the crypto landscape. So Sui and Aptos and Solana employ a very similar architecture for how to basically generate performance that they are generating. Solana, what they all do basically is they have this sort of asynchronous ordering system. Solana does it with something sort of like VDFs. Someone said they're like not really VDFs, but something kind of like that. So verifiable delay functions. But and Sui uses creates directed graphs or a tag. And the purpose of both of these systems is the same. The purpose is that you can just take transactions and you just, order them, and everyone can do that sort of separately, and then you end up with the same result. And on top of that, they also, employ some tactics for how to optimize sending transactions to the leader or the sort of the validator that's building the block, as well as how to propagate them. But I would assume that those are maybe more sophisticated in Solana at this point. I'm not super familiar, but point being is they're very similar approaches to performance. And so they're competing largely for the same segment of users. And if you are a believer in the narrative that that segment of users may in fact be all the users, then, you know, a clean slate implementation, which can learn off what Solana has done and where it has failed, is actually really promising. This isn't a knock on Solana at all. And Solana is kind of doing the same thing now with Firedancer, right? But my point is that there's like, there are like three chains that will potentially, I have a lot of questions on Aptos. I'm not as familiar with all how they've done stuff. And at some point they had a very constrained validator set, et cetera, et cetera. But they're all kind of promising capacity orders of magnitude more than everyone else. And you have slightly different programming models. Is, as far as I know, very well thought out. It's also very like Rust based. My understanding is that it's a little bit more intuitive in some ways than the programming model Solana employs. These are probably personal preferences. There are still people that think Solidity is the best in the world. But point is that like, if we look at the current value, yes, it doesn't make sense to what they currently are. But if we look at sort of the expected value of like the whole crypto market is a lot bigger. There's only 3 chains that can handle that kind of volume. And there's the new shiny things that, at least the way they're pitching it, is, you know, a million times better in every possible way, right? So it's not that crazy. I was still surprised that they went that high because Solana has a much stronger community. They have a lot more active developers and stuff. But just to comment on the actual developers, I think that as well, you have Solana with a lot of developers and very quickly increasing amounts of developers. But Sui and Aptos have managed to get a lot of developer mindshare quite quickly. And so I think what investors are doing are kind of extrapolating that. But so anyway, my point here is basically that they are, you know, fundamentally quite similar. There's no baggage like Solana has more than, you know, some other chains. I'm talking about FTX stuff. And I know, but there's a branding thing. I'm just like painting a picture. I think it's bullshit to think about it that way, but like there's something there and you have a clean slate implementation. So I kind of get it. Sorry?
Alameda, you mean? Because actually, I think that FTX wasn't invested in Sui, and Sui just repurchased their stake from the liquidators. Or what
Yeah.
have you.
Yeah. Alameda. But I mean, generally the FTX debacle that was, you know, Alameda, FTX, everything. But so that's kind of the argument. But yes, ultimately, I think they have a much longer way to go to realize that valuation than Solana does.
Yeah, man. I don't know. Look, same as open source projects, same as anything else, building a developer community is damn hard. You're not just competing for the next billion users or what have you. You're competing a lot for developers. We'll see which one of these succeeds. The valuation, again, to me seems irresponsible and by and large mostly based on speculation on this being a shiny thing. I'm curious how many things you could actually learn from Solana's issues if you're a new chain, which was one of the things that you mentioned. Because frankly, a lot of the mistakes that Solana made that caused issues early on were just fucking stupid design decisions, that having a single port for absolutely everything, right? This is not one of those things where you go like, oh, I was also going to use the single port. Like, good thing that I saw them crash with that. It's just like, why were you doing that in the first place? So not entirely sure that actually contributes. I could see how you could, the narrative around that, if the person that you're selling doesn't necessarily know that. But we'll see. The move actually does, from what little I have seen, I have deploy anything on move or written move, but I did spend some time kicking the tires on the programming language just to get an idea of how much of an edge this has. It does seem to have a lot of sanity stuff that you just don't get on the Solana side of things. Just as a trivial example, you have a different concept for what is a coin and if it's fractionalizable or not than you have for just say random value that happens to be a real number. Those differentiations are interesting and they might lead to saner programs in the long term, which actually that could be a lesson from the Solana side, right? On Solana, when it started, there was this whole thing that developers called chewing glass, where you basically just had to go in and deal with all the crazy stuff of having to write raw Rust without even a framework. That could be a lesson. If you're now building things on top of Anchor, then that is saner, but you still don't have all the extra safety features that you're likely to get from Move. We'll see if that is enough, right? There are a lot of safe, sane programming languages out there. People still use JavaScript because it's where the developers are. So we'll see if that is enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll see. Let's touch on Filecoin and Arweave quickly, and then maybe wrap it up for this session. So I think it's good time to chat about this because Filecoin released their VM, which is EVM compatible, and is sort of now firmly in the race. Though I have yet to hear of anything being built on it. There probably are some things, but somehow it's there hasn't been like a huge tidal wave of excited developers running into that ecosystem. Most of the stuff that I hear about are guys who've basically been like Protocol Labs funded, working on dev tools and stuff like that for a long time. Um, and at the same time, valuation is quite high. It's kind of considered the gold standard for that. But then you have Arweave, which is much lower valuation, really hasn't made much of a dent, but does have use. Like, for example, Lens Protocol, the Aave social media thing, is now moving to store content on Arweave, which makes a lot of sense. I don't know why they thought Polygon was a sensible option. But I mean, POC, whatever. Makes a lot of sense, right? Store the content on Arweave. This is what Mirror, the blogging platform, has been doing for a long time. So there's more and more sort of data in things, and more people are looking around for a solution to the data storage problem, and more they seem to be landing on Arweave. Do you think it's going to change now that the Filecoin VM is out, or how do you see those dynamics kind of evolving?
That's really tricky, man. I mean, again, we're talking about capturing developer mindshare. And okay, first of all, we need to separate two things here. One of them is valuation, which is where we started, and price does have price does have marketing power when it comes to attracting devs, right? So there is that because it nothing else it makes from the outside people tend to interpret it as like, oh, this is more established for whatever reason. So that is one thing. The second is, are you gonna be able to attract people that understand this? You know, what's the right way to put it? How much of a ramp up? If I'm a developer, how much of a ramp up am I going to need to start working on this? Now, not having coded anything for Filecoin, I don't know how much of a difference there is once you get into the model itself, but you get to claim like, oh, this is an EVM. So people might just assume that the knowledge transfers. Whereas on Arweave, you will need to show up and learn the whole thing that they're doing with their own application model. Now, as for storage, usage itself, that's really tricky to estimate. I really like Arweave. I think there's a case of uses. There's a whole host of cases where you definitely want permanent storage. what we were talking earlier about code bases, I think Arweave would be the perfect target for the centralized GitHub. It's something that fits their model beautifully. You're basically adding deltas to something that you want to have available. So that seems to fit it just right. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that you may not want to have permanently stored. And on Arweave, the only way to effectively remove something from the network is to have every single node that stores it agree that they're no longer going to store it anymore, which you know, I that is let's say that that's going to become increasingly unlikely as the network grows. So say if you want to build, if I were right now just looking at platforms, at decentralized storage platforms to build an Instagram, for instance, do you want to trust people's photos that they may want to remove in the future to a platform that's going to store everything permanently? Like that becomes a harder decision to explain to your users, right? Now, if I'm building an NFT application, an NFT based thing, then great. These are things that would ideally be immutable. But that is not going to use as much storage as something that is going to store a whole bunch of videos and photos, right? So the sweet spot up to a point on permanency versus volume for me immediately on Arweave that I can think of or at least of use cases that I would use personally as an individual, right? Because there's the whole Solana for a while was storing a lot of, or I'm not sure if it's still, it was bridging a lot of its transaction log data to Arweave. So that is definitely one case of something you want permanently. But myself as an individual would be something like encrypted data backups that I want to have accessible. And I know that I'm encrypting them myself. And if I trust my key management, then, fine, it's going to be out there until the end of time. It will be something like that because it is something where you do want permanency and where you want and where you would have a large volume of data that you're sending out there. By and large, most of the stuff that I do not necessarily want it to be around until the end of time. So anyway, I think that they're basically in a position where there is a hard sell on finding product market fit for things that do require storage at scale, where this would actually add value to the token that's being spent. That's my main issue that I see with.
Right. Yeah. One issue I have with Filecoin right now is we pulled the performance stats. It has a 30-second block time, no finality.
Yeah.
Like that feels like performance from 5 years ago or
Yeah.
something. Maybe not 5, but 3. I don't know, something like that. My point is that like I think in many cases the use case is sort of pretty end user centric. Like you're serving something to the end user, and I think they had some kind of CDN network in the plan, so maybe there's a solution to that. But just as a foundation, and their plan is to run EVM applications, so I would assume those are direct to end user. If you need to wait 30 seconds, that's slower than Ethereum right now.
And I hear you. But again, as you mentioned, people are not necessarily rushing to either of these things. So let's just and let's not forget, and much as I hate this, let's not forget that marketing solves a whole lot of things. I mean, Cardano is still in the top fucking 10 for whatever reason, right? So maybe this is just an issue of like we're out there, we are gonna start working on these problems. And not being crazy about Filecoin, just giving them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they think they can work on those problems while they continue to push the platform. Whereas
Well,
I have yet to hear if anyone pushing Arweave on any way, shape, or form for in like a year and a half or something like.
well, this is kind of the interesting thing as well. So it's just touch on the marketing. standpoint is I think those are two organizations who are both very crappy at marketing. Like Filecoin has this like intense, or this is kind of culture from Protocol Labs. They have this intense academic focus that I don't think very naturally sort of goes over into engineers and specifically or like product people that are more sort of end user focused. So like Filecoin just seems quite boring. Purely from like
But
a perception standpoint.
fine, and this is not going to be like the same people who rush into an NFT mint. But you do hear Filecoin coming up on podcasts. You do hear Filecoin people
That's
getting
true.
like either showing up on guests, getting advertised. They're getting out there. I can't recall when was the last time that I happened to stumble upon something involving Sam. I just actively have to go out and look for what the heck is going on.
That's true. Yeah.
And I mean,
Well,
Sam,
that's what I was gonna
Sam,
say. Is
Sam from Arweave.
Yeah, well, yeah, this one I was gonna say is Arweave sucks at it as well. And they're very poor at communicating what it is that you can do with the system. Like I at some point looked into when they announced kind of their programming model or basically their version of smart contracts. And I never really saw anything about it again. So I just wasn't really paying attention. So now I honestly have no fucking idea what you can and can't do. Like I have no mental concept. And this is something where I do think the EVM compatibility matters, is that Filecoin kind of comes out with like WASM and EVM compatibility. That's very tangible. Like every engineer in crypto and beyond will have some inkling of what it looks like to program for that environment. It's not going to be like that. They're going to go and do something, and it's all going to be different, and they'll mess them up. That
That's what I
doesn't
said.
matter.
You know, the realities of programming in the environment, once you get into it, might be who knows what the hell kind of tentacle blob thing. But they got you because it sounded familiar, right? And
Yeah.
now you have the, you know, now you have spent all this time, you know, you have this sunk cost. Yeah, let's give this a shot because you already convinced yourself that it was worth trying earlier. You're not necessarily going to abandon that time investment, and it's still familiar, right? Whereas you might get a similar programming model surprise on the Arweave side, but you have to learn all this other stuff anyway.
Yeah. But to be clear, I am excited for both of those projects. So this has basically been a podcast of crapping on projects that I'm excited about.
Is that true? Myself as well. I'm not that excited about Filecoin. I am very excited about. I was very excited about Arweave. I'm still very bullish on its potential. It's just that there's in my mind this whole thing of theses have an expiration date, and I really haven't seen that much change in the last couple of years. Let's say that. Anyway, it's causing me. It's kind of like at some point you have got to stop being bullish about that project that you thought was going to change the world 5 years ago, right? It's we'll see.
All right. Well, on those undying words, we'll end. Thank you everyone for listening. I'd say everyone, but that might be the wrong term. Maybe I should say just thank you.
We are actually thanking everyone, no matter the number.
Right. Indeed. All right. See you next time.